All right. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Credit and Collection News Podcast. We have a great show set up for you guys today. We have the ACA International here. We have two representatives from the ACA International. We have the ACA International's CEO, Scott Purcell, and joining Scott is the ACA Vice President of Government and State Affairs, which is Andy Madden. So welcome, guys. Appreciate you guys taking the time and having a little chat about what's going on in the industry.
Steve, so glad to be here with you. Thanks for making time for us.
So why don't we get started? As usual, the news keeps happening. There's a ton of stuff going on the newsletter. I know most of the people here subscribe to the newsletter, so they're seeing these headlines, they're reading the articles, so they're kind of saying, hey, what's going on in the industry and what's happening? So that's kind of what we're going to talk about today. And one of the first things that's been running through the newsletter, burning it up, usually it's the CFPB, but our friends from the FCC have jumped in as well because they don't want to be left out. And they've kind of been talking about the AI generated voice, which is they've now called it illegal. They say it's subject to the TCPA, which is it's a big thing. What's going on? And like I said, they don't want to be left out of all the headline news. So let's shoot at them first and kind of talk about what's going on with the FCC and how the industry's looking at that, and go from there.
Steve, that's a great jumping off point. And ACA as a trade association has a big advocacy voice in Washington, D.C., and Andy as well in the states. At the federal level, we maintain relationships with over 50 members of Congress. Often those are in House Financial Services and Senate Banking, but as well as Energy and Commerce, who oversee the FCC, a very important role there, as well as with the regulators. And indeed, I myself, last week, despite it being a full week, had 6 different meetings with the FCC on a different issue, not the AI voice-generated one. You know, what's interesting, what that brought that one, I think it was somebody who was impersonating President Biden's voice that caught their ire. That was a big deal. I think those things are wrong, the impersonation where there's not authorization to do it. And so I can see the motivation for moving on something and moving quickly. We've been very measured in how we approach both the regulators and Congress about AI, because often it's not very well defined. And all of the automation tools that the banks and the credit unions, the collection agencies use today, a lot of how the general definitions are, people are lumping robotic process automation in as AI. Well, that's not generative AI. It's what are we talking about? And I think this was a little bit like that. The fact that they ended up with it as a pre-recorded voice, I can see where they're coming from, and it gives them a certain fence. When we look at it, a lot of our members use voice bots. And so I think the main thing on the ruling last week from the FCC is to remember that prohibition is on outbound calls using that artificial voice. So those need to be consented, and they need to follow the pre-recorded rules. I think most members are dealing with that already. I think the most important and salient piece is to remember inbound calls from consumers speaking to the voice bots are not covered by what the FCC ruled on last week. And that's a huge difference between inbound and outbound, and what machines or tools, technology are we using to communicate. Those inbound calls using our voice bots still can happen. And that's good news from that perspective.
Absolutely. And I know that that was definitely, I think, what kind of kicked things off. We're into election season, of course. And I think it was in Delaware that you were, referring to, where President Biden was, his AI voice was contacting folks in Delaware, reminding them to vote for him and do that. So we're not really sure what's going on, but I'm sure that's can be a little bit tricky when all of a sudden you're getting a call from somebody and you're not sure, is that really somebody or is it not? It used to be I believe in the old days they used to say it was an impersonating voice. Used to get those phone calls from Arnold Schwarzenegger, and then afterwards they would say, celebrity voice impersonated. So that way they were at least identifying who it was. And of course, if you listen real carefully and stuff, and I know I'm not important enough to get a phone call from the Terminator to let me know that I'm late on my bills. But that's something that I know is becoming very, very heated and all there, and even celebrities are jumping all over this because not only is their voice being intimidated, but also their likeness, and that's a another huge issue that'll be there. Obviously, that's not as something that's going to affect our industry, at least not yet, until we start getting FaceTimes from celebrities that say pay your bills. We're I think we're a little bit safe. Andy, did you want to throw anything in there as well on
Yeah,
this?
just one of the things we are seeing from the state side that a lot of states are starting to introduce legislation on AI. The good news is as of right now, they're taking a slow approach to it. A lot of these are creating studies, creating task forces to look at it, because as Scott mentioned, it really goes down to definitions. They don't know how to define what AI is yet and what is it that you would try to regulate. This is actually, we track about 900 bills related to the arm industry across the country each year. This is a new category. We never tracked this before, but now we are starting to track AI bills that are out there just because of the potential impact they could have on our country. And then when you look at what the attorneys general are looking at right now, they're all very interested, but they also don't exactly know how to act yet. So they're talking in all of their conferences. What do we do? It's one of the subjects they have. But I think the good news is they are still at this point taking a slow approach to it, which is what we want. We don't want to see them react too quickly and maybe squash what could be good technology coming down the line while still making sure that we are protected.
I definitely agree. I know last year at our conference in San Diego, we had two AGs, both from Texas and from Idaho, they talked a little bit about it because at that point, again, last year, AI wasn't as it wasn't quite as a hot topic yet. There were a lot of other issues that were coming up ahead of it, but it definitely progresses on. And again, everybody wants to jump in on this. I know data privacy has moved itself up, and now you're finding all the states are, if they haven't already implemented it, 3 years ago, I think it was, California was looking at implementing data privacy, and a couple other states were jumping on that thing as well. And now all of a sudden, you've got every state that says, we want to regulate data privacy. The feds are looking at it, and what is quote unquote data privacy, and what, who's responsible, what are they supposed to do, what is the technical fine that should be if you're not being careful with data, what's going to happen. And of course, everyone in our industry is concerned, needs to be aware of it, how to handle it. And that's one of the things that I think, like I said, you'll see from every state is jumping on this. Of course, the FTC, the CFPB, which, and especially, we've all been through the, a state says one thing, the feds say something else. Kind of look at FODI and what if we go back far enough, if you got conflicting rules, what are we supposed to do? So how do you guys handle that? When you look at things like data privacy and what's going on?
Steve, great question. Before we move on, I do want to say Arnold's Super Bowl ad, that was incredibly endearing, and I'm glad he's back in the spotlight, and I appreciated that a ton. You're exactly right. From an advocacy standpoint, when you've got either duplicative or conflicting rules, that's problematic for industry. Everybody in industry wants to do the right thing, and I think we continue to beat that drum in our advocacy work. We continue to educate that there are standards, there are things that make sense, but they shouldn't be duplicative and they shouldn't be conflicting. And when they are, we bring those items out. I'll say just as so we've got the advocacy piece, but ACA is launching an intentional community because at the end of the day, we want to protect consumers' data, just plain and simple. That's the goal. And so this new community is for cybersecurity folks that are different members, as well as those folks that are designated as the qualified individual from the FTC safeguards rules. It's like, okay, now you're the qualified individual, but what does that mean? And really, we're partnering with one of our affinity folks at TPX, cybersecurity experts, that we'll have a community where people can talk about emerging threats, emerging best practices, what's keeping those CISOs up at night, and a community that speaks the language of a cybersecurity professional so they can work on the practical. So that's, Steve, one of the things ACA is doing just to help people accomplish the main goal, keep that consumer data safe. And then the bigger goal is working really hard at not having things that are duplicative and not having things that are conflicting at the federal and state level.
Perfect segue going from AI to data privacy, because sort of what I talked about at the AI level right now, seems like states are, hey, at least slowing down. They don't want to necessarily act. They want to see, hey, maybe we can have something at the federal level because we would like to have uniformity across state lines. At the state level, I think after California, that was sort of the gist. Hey, let's do that. That didn't take. So now you have every single state with some sort of policy out there. You've got well over a dozen states with really comprehensive security and data privacy legislation that's out there that has now been enacted. California is still sort of the ceiling, and I think that's kind of what we would like to see is, hey, let's at least allow that to be the ceiling as other ones come in. But I think the ship has sailed, and we now have all of these states with different policies. We don't want to reinvent that on the AI side of things or on other issues as well. When we can have uniformity, that's what we want.
No, I definitely agree. And it becomes complicated because everyone wants to be in compliance. And then suddenly your compliance department is, suddenly larger than your collection floor because you're trying to figure out how am I going to follow all these rules and stay within the guidelines and not get in trouble, and yet do my core business, which is really trying to collect the dollars that are owed for our clients. So yeah, it becomes a significant challenge for everybody to balance. Where do you put all your dollars? Because you want to be within compliant. Because if you're not in compliant, you're going to start hearing from folks, whether it be from the state or the federal level. So you've got to stay on top of that, and you definitely want to be within the guidelines of everybody, because consumers are, they live everywhere. Everybody moves, everybody changes places, and that just makes the challenge of collecting that much harder. So when you kind of look at the collecting and where it is, this is maybe another way to jump into another segment. Let's talk about our friends at the CFPB. They are usually in the headlines probably 3 or 4 times a week on the newsletter, because the CFPB is doing everything, trying to regulate and make sure the rules and regs are there, establishing new rules. They've got a new, the digital payment rule is something that they're looking at. They also are probing today's newsletter. They're looking at Honda Finance, and I know Toyota and Hyundai Finance have been in their crosshairs previously. So auto finance is becoming one of those things for, and of course our industry helps collect on those dollars. So the CFPB, let's talk somewhat about them and what's going on, and how to help manage everything that's coming out of that big behemoth out of DC.
There's so much to it, and I agree. It's a little overwhelming at times, the number of pronouncements and items that get discussed in the news each week, Steve. When Celia Law was decided, that made it pretty clear that the CFPB operates as a political arm of the White House, which was, I don't think, the original intent, but that brings a political element to the Bureau. And that's not helpful, because then everybody's trying to ferret out, well, what is a political statement versus what is something that is a true regulation, something that needs to be followed, and does it make sense or not? Is there overstep or not overstep? And so I'll just go into the Toyota and the Honda. The denominator is always important to me. We had one ACA member that got written up in the paper as having the most complaints in their state out of the CFPB database. And that was a factually correct statement, but nobody knew the denominator. And then when we talked to that member, they said, that's correct, but with our denominator, because of the volume of business we do, we get one complaint out of every 17,000 interactions with consumers. That's 99.9996%. No complaints. Nobody understands that. You know, you notice on the Toyota, they have 5 million consumer accounts they're dealing with. And so part of it is understanding scale. Part of it is understanding what's intentional versus what's unintentional. I remember one case was of a collection agency. They found 1,300 transactions not handled properly, but the denominator was 2 million. And so is 1,300 on 2 million intentional? Or is that the way of the world? There is no perfect people, no perfect system. We have to deal with some of those. And so, especially with consent orders, it's like, what are people agreeing to? Because it's more effective to settle at that point versus to spend all of the resources to prove that there actually wasn't a violation. So it's hard to ferret out. I will say, I think it's very important for all of us to pay attention to what happens in those different cases and to take out the pieces and to make sure our systems are compliant with the laws and regulations that we all adhere to. And I do think the CFPB does signal appropriately things we need to be paying attention to in terms of passing judgment when the denominators aren't clear or egregious, like the 1,300 on 2 million. You know, we let other people make those judgments, whether or not the magnitude of that mistake, if you will.
Yeah, because you will see things, and again, it as you know, as a news provider, that's one of the things we look at. How is the headline worded, and we try to, when we look at the articles that are coming out, you know, the verbiage is we try to take a very neutral stance, but neutral doesn't sell, and you know, a lot of the mainstream media is looking for sensationalism because that does sell. And again, the idea behind it is you got to put eyeballs onto the news, and they're trying to sell something. They're selling news. In order to sell news, if you know, the denominator gets left out because that number is so high, you know, the way they look at it, you know, that's just, you know, it will be mentioned in the article, but it might be on line, you know, 73 versus on line 2 where it should be, because then it's not quite headline news. And that's one of the things that we kind of look at from our standpoint, is always trying to make sure that the articles are written in a neutral standpoint. They can't always be, but you know, you try to go that route and try to do it, you know, again on the same thing. I know that when you look at the CFP as an overall, particularly since it's run by an individual and not run by a committee, that's another piece that we have to look at, you know, from a political standpoint. And they always say, well, elections do matter, and they do, because we've had blue leaders and we've had red leaders of the CFPB, and it seems that the direction changes when that happens. And so that's one of the things that, you know, when they say elections do matter, and you know, why do we vote the way we do? That is part of it. So you know, when everybody is going to the ballots this year, we shall see what happens. And I know that's always becomes a something that everyone kind of looks at and says, okay, where are we at? Why is it important? The way Congress leans, or the way the Senate leans, or where the White House leans? It is because it definitely has a reflection on the industry and how it goes. And if the pendulum swings back and forth, and which it always does, that's one of the things to look at. Andy, you want to chime in? I know you handle the states, but the states do kind of follow the CFPB's lead, particularly if the CFPB finds some gold under that rock with some, you know, regulations and things along that. And we're going to hit a little bit about that a little bit later. But you know, how the CFPB works with the AGs. I know that in certain some stances, they were very comfortable with it, and then other times, because originally, when Cordray came, I think the AGs kind of felt a little more proud because one of theirs was now leading the feds. But then they kind of found out that that wasn't quite as, comfortable as they thought it was going to be. So there you have it. I won't take away any of your thunder.
Oh, absolutely. Well, it's always interesting. In my world, I have to deal with a lot of state regulators, a lot of state legislators. And, when you're dealing with the legislators, you expect everything to be political. When you're dealing with the regulators, you're hoping that it's a little less political. And elections do have consequences. We were dealing with legislation in Michigan last year, we dealt with really expanding garnishment. And after a couple local elections, you had one chamber go back to even. So now it was not one party control. Basically, everything came to a screeching halt. We're still there until they have a special election a little bit later this spring. And then there's probably going to be one party control again. They're going to hit the gas, and it's going to be a lot of fun in the Michigan legislature. But elections do have their consequences there. So that's just one little example. Yes, I do think that the states do take a lot of influence from the CFPB, the CFPB action. And then sometimes you're surprised that they do not. When we look at the New York Department of Financial Services, they started a rulemaking back in very late 2021, right before Regulation F was going to go into effect, and they put out their rule for comment, which we commented on in early 2022, I guess. The rule writers, didn't know that Regulation F was coming down the pike, which just blew everybody in the industry's mind. Like, how on earth do these folks not know what's coming down the pike of something of that magnitude? So there were absolute, complete and utter direct conflicts with it. They also didn't realize that within 10 days of them putting out the first version of this proposed rule, that the governor was going to be signing two pieces of legislation that were then also going to be in conflict with this rule. So while yes, they do take a lot of lead from maybe the CFPB or maybe their executive office or what's going on with the legislature, not always. And that's a lot of what we have to do is we try to talk to regulators and try to let them know that, hey, the first thing is make sure that whatever you're putting out is something that your own state can comply with and does not go in direct conflict with federal law, does not go in direct conflict with city laws, local laws, or your state laws at all. Probably the biggest issue I'm seeing right now where there's, I think, a lot of lead of the CFPB kind of stirring up an issue, and we'll see where it goes at the state level. It is on their FCRA rulemaking and the proposals to limit credit reporting on medical debt. We are seeing an awful lot of states introduce and start advancing legislation on this front. We've got a lobbying team with our 32 lobbyists out there, our 32 state units out there working on this. One of our number one talking points is, hey, why don't you pump the brakes on this? The CFPB has said they are going to address this issue. It's going to be done with lots of time for comment. All industry, they're going to have a SABRIFA panel, which they've already conducted. And whatever happens, at least then we will have one uniform approach across the country, which we kind of talked about earlier in this podcast. Some states and some chairmen of all colors get it. They're like, hey, that makes perfect sense. We do not want to get ahead of the game in this particular issue. Others, I think it's strictly for political that they're trying to push this for. If anything, I think it tells them, hey, hit the gas. We've got to get to this before the CFPB does. We want to get credit for doing this. So they do take the lead sometimes. Sometimes I think they compete, and sometimes they don't have any idea what the other entities are doing.
Yeah, that's definitely something that comes up. And again, yeah, you do want to, because what's the joke with the AGs is, what does AG stand for? Aspiring governor. So there you have it. If you want to move up in the world, and the political one, the closer you get to the top, there's fewer and fewer positions. So you need to go that route if you're going to stay within the political arena. If you're going to get outside the political arena, it's perfectly fine to go that route, but it definitely makes a difference. Again, where it all comes down to, where you want to move in your life, and then how do you react and how do you do it? Because everybody wants to have something attached to their name that they can sit there and say, hey, that was me, I did that. Whether it be good or whether it be bad, you want to be known, and that's one way to get known. I know one of the things that has made the headlines, and we're kind of seeing that right now, is the amount of delinquency that is on the rise again. And that's something that the economy is there. I mean, depending on who you ask, the economy is getting better, the economy is getting worse. We're going into a recession. We're not going into a recession. We're not there. It's kind of an unknown, but one of the things that's happened is when the New York Fed just put out their numbers, um, basically consumer credit delinquencies are definitely on the rise again. And that's one of the things that are out there, which is again a double-edged sword to the industry. If numbers are up, that means the industry is growing. That means we need to produce more results with the numbers. But it also brings out a lot of different strategies and things that are happening. How does technology do there? And again, AI is tied into that. The CFPB has just recently gone after firms that are supposedly helping debt relief, that are not really helping. They're just basically making money. There's a huge debt relief foreclosure, who I know is not related to the industry, but the mainstream ties to tie it in together and say, hey, this is all part of the bad industry that does this. So, you know, it's that the positive results that the ACA needs to do, and keep the industry clean, and keep us on the good side. We're the guys wearing the white hats. What helps, and I know that's one of the things that the industry tries to do. And Scott, I know you're the champion of wearing that white hat out there that says, hey, you know what, we're necessary, we're part of it, we're 7% of the back end, but that's a lot of money that needs to be collected on there, and for the other 93% that do pay their bills, hey, we don't want to pay for the other half. So I'll let you throw on that white hat and kind of talk a little bit about that.
No, Steve, appreciate the compliment. And it's near and dear to me. It's, there's a couple different pieces to it. One is the inflation impact. ACA members return about $90 billion a year back to the creditor community. And in doing so, that saves every American family about $700 a year from rising costs. That's significant, especially in these high inflation times, to know that's the value of what we do. But even more near and dear to my heart and our members is the role we play in enabling Americans access to credit. Access to credit can be a safety net. It definitely allows Americans to enjoy the quality of lifestyle that they have today. I'm not afraid to say this in public, but I came from a fantastic family, but we were broke. I was the very first in my family to go to university. And I did that after I was married and had 3 kids. I became a CPA. And I remember right after graduating from university, I blew a head gasket. I didn't have $1,700 in the bank. I had to put that $1,700 on a credit card. In that example, it was a safety net that got us back on the road. And I know the judicious use of credit truly does impact Americans' lives, especially those that are struggling. Now, can people get over indebted? Absolutely. And there's other ways to solve that problem. I think some of the $2 billion, if I have my figures straight from the CFPB, their fund could be used to help educate, because we talk about wanting to educate, but typically we don't fund the education programs in the schools. I think that could be a great step forward. But back to the point at hand, Andy, you and I worked on a project last year using data from the CFPB's own research arm, as well as the Federal Reserve Bank in New York, their research arm, and some TransUnion data. And we were able to show, I live in the state of Oregon, and we had a very pernicious bill that was going to greatly expand the garnishment exemptions. And with that data, we were able to show that would reduce access to credit by about $15 billion a year for Oregonians, about $5,500 for everybody that had a credit card. And we were able to show what the credit score bands were by demographic. So in the Black community, in the Hispanic community, the Asian community, et cetera. So the lawmakers understood the number of people. In other words, that bill might help this many people in terms of improved economics if we increase those GARN exemptions. But the reality was it was going to hurt about 1.2 million Oregonians in terms of having their access to credit reduced. And in terms of, you talk about wearing that hat, showing the good work we do, to me, that speaks volumes in terms of how what we do and what the creditor community does actually has such a positive impact on people with low credit scores, their lives. And the Fed Reserve report was stating the obvious. People with lower credit scores get hurt the most in that equation. Like, duh, we all know that, but they have the science to prove it now. But I think that's the important thing. People's lives actually do get impacted. I think about unelected officials in Washington and how they prioritize some of these hypothetical concepts, and they are very effective election talking points. Don't get me wrong, I understand why they do it. But at the end of the day, it doesn't actually help solve why is medical care expensive? Why is a higher education expensive? Playing these games on credit reporting might be a good soundbite, but it doesn't solve the fundamental root cause of why healthcare and education are expensive in this country. Okay, I'm off the soapbox now.
Andy, you want to jump on the soapbox? You got a chance here.
You see the pleasure I get to work with on a daily basis. I don't have to add anything to that because I mean Scott just absolutely knocked it out of the park. We kind of talk when you're talking about the when you see a rise in defaults, what happens? You can talk about it from the operation standpoint, the economic standpoint. I always see it from the political standpoint. And what it does, it allows these stories to kind of permeate through the media, and then it helps drive what I always consider bad policy. Instead of trying to fix the economy, you try to do a one size fits all and put all industry and all consumers into one box, and that never works. That's never the way you should regulate. It's never the way you should legislate. But that doesn't mean that we're not going to be there to prioritize for legislators of what the industry truly needs.
No, I 100% agree with you guys. And I know you see a lot of people in our industry that basically are, I mean, education is a huge piece. I know I personally do, classes, whether it be through the high school or religious institutions. We're teaching kids about credit because it's most kids just don't understand. And it's not a subject that's really talked about at home about finance and stuff. Hey, take out a student loan, jump out that, and we see what the debacle has become is that people just don't understand. The government doesn't set a good example because they basically will, they borrow and they borrow and they borrow and they never pay it off. And so consumers think, well, can I do the same thing? If government does it, why can't I? There is, there's good credit and there's bad credit. So you need to understand that, and understand where it is, and teaching our younger generation about credit, I think, is valuable. And obviously, it's why I do it. That's why I like a lot of people in our industry do it, and support it. And I think that's kind of the last topic we'll kind of jump on a little bit is junk fees and robocalls, because those are huge. Those are election bits that we were talking about earlier. I mean, junk fees. What is junk fee? Well, I don't know what a junk fee is. And if you're late for paying your credit card and you get a $35 extra charge, is that a junk fee, or is that because you're actually late on making payments? And if somebody issues you credit and you say you're going to pay it back and you don't, is that a junk fee? It's one of those things that's out there, and it's the same thing with robocalls. A collection agency making a call that says you're delinquent that's not a robocall. But you know what? It sometimes gets categorized as that because they're like, hey, you know what? It's an unwanted call. Well, yeah, technically it is. You don't want to get that phone call that says you're late on something, but the reality is, if you are, maybe you do want that reminder. You want, someone to work with you and do that. So let's talk a little bit about junk fees and identifying that. I know, again, this is a huge election year, and that's one of the topics about, getting rid of junk fees. And big banks have already cut over $2 billion of revenue We ran that article that we just put out there on overdraft fees that have been reduced. But that's revenue to institutions, and if suddenly you're cutting 2 billion in revenue from junk fees, that revenue has to be replaced somehow. And that's one of the things that let's talk a little bit about that and where we're going. And again, how do you identify it and make it right?
Steve, we actually wrote an op-ed. We write lots of letters to legislators as well on this topic. I think it's dangerous to use the term junk fees because it becomes very broad and it becomes, well, everything's a junk fee that I'm not happy with. And it's dangerous from that standpoint. It calls into question everything. Everything is a big topic, but a lot of things by just putting this label that's not well defined. It's not defined anywhere. I've heard one which I think has a righteous element to it. If you're surprised by it, you get to the end of a transaction and all of a sudden this shows up on your bill and you had no idea it existed. I don't know that I would call it a junk fee. It was an unidentified or an undisclosed fee. And that's different from now a credit card late fee. Credit card late fee has always been tied to a specific action, you being late on making your payment outside the grace period. And so I think there's a danger in that. You'd mentioned the 2 billion reduction because people do see the signal, they do hear the signal, they respond. They don't want to be in the spotlight, but at the same time, that money gets made up in other ways. I remember you had Congressman Barr on podcast, and we spent a lot of time with Congressman Barr. He definitely understands the industry well and appreciates what it means to the everyday American. And hearing him speak and listening to other folks, that money will be made up probably through higher interest costs, which is not going to be targeted at people having a specific action like being late on their credit card payment. It's like everybody. It's almost analogous to the Garn story, Steve, right? I said, you're going to help this many people, but you're going to hurt this many people. I feel it's the same analogy there with the $35 versus the $8, and it just doesn't feel right in terms of which behaviors are we incentivizing, and are we making people pay for things they shouldn't have to pay for. And I've heard Senator Brown, chair of Senate Banking, speak about this. He's like, well, why don't the banks just make less money? I can appreciate the sentiment, but it's not how the real world works. When you look at you look at what capitalism has done in terms of the quality of life for everybody in the community. It's the least worst of all the economic systems available to us in the world. And it's one of those things that we need to grapple with. And so it's tough, but I think it's dangerous to use that phrase junk fees because it ends up being applied in other parts of our life, and it's just wrong.
Coming at it from the state side of things, what we're really seeing, it all goes down to definitions. I mean, it really has to be definitions and the scope of what you're going to do. If you're going to define a fee, what is that fee? Luckily, on the state side of things, we're really seeing if you're going after very, very specific fees from time to time. And then we do have states where we've been on the offense. In Minnesota, we wanted to make sure that we were able to collect a processing fee when actually collecting a debt. We were able to get that into an omnibus bill last year with the Department of Commerce. In the state of Montana, we've been able to get it through one chamber twice, haven't been able to quite get it over the hump. But again, to make sure that you are able to collect that processing fee, just specifically when it is you as an agent, a collection agency processing a collection fee and running through a bank. Legislators seem to get it as long as it's not going to be a profit maker for the agency themselves. But then once you start getting, what they're doing at the federal level, and that definition starts expanding, the expanding definition is 90% of my life in the medical debt world right now. Of how are they going to find what a medical debt is? Does it cover acupuncturists or massages or dental work or plastic surgery, things along those lines? If you're talking about credit reporting on something, would it actually expand where it could cover a credit card or a home equity line if that home equity line or credit card was ever actually used in a Target to buy a Band-Aid or a packet of Advil? Depending on how this legislation is written, the answer is yes. So trying to bring that definition down, I think, is exactly what we do on the medical debt side of things, exactly what we need to do anytime they're talking about fees. And I do not like the term junk fee.
Steve, you talked about robocalls. ACA actually has many creditor members as well. And I remember one bank reaching out to me last year saying their texts and calls were getting caught or stopped. And the robocalls is difficult. None of us like to get an unwanted call. But I will take people back. Both sides of the table, red and blue, consumer groups in our lobby, we were at the table together on the Traced Act and came up with some good solutions. But those solutions still aren't implemented yet. The redress provisions, if you will, when a call gets blocked, to figure out what's a good caller, a good sender, and who is not. All of those provisions were well thought, but not fully implemented yet. So we tend as a society to throw a lot of things against the wall. The reality is our members have worked hard, and I know this is true in the banking community as well, to get consent. For our members that have robust texting program, many of them have opt-out rates that are near zero. Definitely everyone I've talked to is in the single digits. So it's consumers want to use that method of communication. And so for me, I get really frustrated when I see these other actions come into play that block consented calls. And so in all of our ex parte filings with the FCC, we beat that drum a lot. It's like all of this activity is blocking a consented call. The consumer wanted it, and this other action prevented that text or that call from getting through. And that doesn't seem right at all.
Yeah, no, I see where you guys are going, and it makes sense. And like I said, again, you just, whether it's a robocall, a junk fee, those seem to be like almost election terms, because people are they're jumping on that because they want it to, again, this is bad, this is good, this is bad, when I'm against bad, so therefore elect me. And that's definitely that's we need to identify, we need to make sure that it's there, and I know you guys do a good job of that. So that's definitely where we're at. We have been talking for quite a long time. Is there anything else that you guys would like to say or talk about before we end this podcast?
Steve, I just appreciate you. I've been to a few of your conferences and get to give the ACA update. And I appreciate the people that follow you and your outlet, because we're all in this together. It is an ecosystem that serves the needs of the American public, something we're all very proud of, that we take seriously. And the reality is we need to be at the table finding workable solutions, practical solutions. Just last week, we were a whole bunch of calls with the FCC on the revocation rule. They have a provision there that we're supposed to text consumers back at 2 a.m. within 5 minutes whenever they text us. Well, I have another law, the FDCPA, that says I cannot text a consumer at 2 o'clock in the morning. Those kinds of practical things, we need to continue to be at the table and find solutions. So appreciate you, appreciate the podcast and the opportunity for us to be in community, to drive change that will benefit everyone. American people need access to credit, and this part of the ecosystem, very proud to represent, and glad we get to be connected. Andy?
Yeah, I would ditto those remarks, Scott, and just Steve, thank you for having us on today. At the beginning, you said elections have consequences. Yes, they do. And the way you can help form that is to get involved, whether it's getting involved in the legislative process, the regulatory process, or the electoral process. So just one pitch to your listeners of, hey, it's a very interesting year. Find a way to get involved.
Couldn't agree with you guys more. I appreciate you guys taking the time to be on the podcast today, because it's all vital. It's all part of the industry and where we're going and where we want to be. And everyone needs to kind of be aware. And if they're not aware, get involved with the ACA on the national level. Get involved with your state chapters and collections. Whether you be a creditor, whether you be an agency, whether you be an attorney, these are all important things that they should be involved with, and at least understand what's there, because the last thing you want to do is find out that some legislation was passed that nobody was paying attention to, that suddenly can have a dramatic and drastic effect on the industry and where we're going and where we want to be. And if that affects your business, then you want to be aware of it on the front end and not be aware of it after it becomes a law that can certainly affect all your business and what's happening. So with that, gentlemen, again, I want to thank you for your time. I know, Scott, I appreciate you coming out to the conferences and being there. I know we're going to have you back out at our next show in Sonoma. And Andy, I'll let you talk to Scott about if you're going to be coming out to Sonoma as well. I'm sure everyone would like to hear from you, and we'll go from there. But that's way outside my control. And definitely way past the podcast, the whole say so on that. So with that, gentlemen, thank you very much for being here, and we will go from there. Appreciate it, and you guys have yourselves a great day. And thanks for listening to the Credit and Collection News Podcast today and every day. Appreciate it.